My name is Keith McHenry, and I'm 68 years old, and I live in Santa Cruz, California, and I was born in Frankfurt, West Germany. So I grew up in national parks. My father was a ranger. My grandfather was one of the first rangers. And so I lived in the wilderness most of my childhood. And also, I was fortunate enough that my father's father, who was the park ranger, took us to the Hopi land, Old Arriby, and to visit with the elders, which he had lived with when he was on his way to be the first ranger at the Grand Canyon. And so I got to see the snake dances and the green corn dances in the oldest, permanently inhabited village in the United States before there were power lines and all those kind of things. So now, and I got to hike I played on the rim of the Grand Canyon. I played in Big Bend in the desert. I would cross the river in Rio Grande to play basketball with my friends in Boquillas and Santa Lina. And then I lived in Luray, Virginia, which was a very brutal experience because it was still at a time when they had no colored allowed or colored only, whites only, and no Jews allowed signs in the stores. And they desegregated our elementary school in when I was in the sixth grade, and they basically declared all the black people on the west side of the tracks to have Down syndrome. So, and I had dyslexia, so I was diagnosed with Down syndrome, even though it was dyslexia, because it was rural America. And so we had mandatory Christian education. We had to sing Dixie every morning in the Lord's Prayer. So that was from fourth grade to eighth grade, and then luckily, Park Service kids in those days were sent away to this place called Wasatch Academy in Mount Pleasant, Utah, which is a small boarding school run by the Presbyterian Church. And there was 175 students. It was co-ed. And it was in 1970 when LSD and all that was happening, and the Beatles and John Lennon and, Led Zeppelin and all that. So I got to be free of my parents at age 14 and pretty much ran my life from that time on. And like a lot of people at that time, to raise money, I sold pot and LSD, and that's pretty much how that became a standard operating system for a while to raise funds, including once I started my own graphic design business. So that I think was my mom's dad was in the Office of Strategic Services, and he was very proud of the fact that he directed the most deadly bombing campaign in world history called Operation Meeting House, which was the firebombing of Tokyo. And he was very close friends with Curtis LeMay, General Curtis LeMay. That was probably one of his best friends, and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And I watched him repeatedly in the for he died when I was 14, and I lived with him the year before he died, argue with them to drop the atomic bomb on Hanoi, claiming we had to send a message to the to the communists that we were, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just one-offs, but that we were crazy enough to keep using nuclear weapons. And thankfully, they rejected his proposal. But at the same time, Curtis LeMay was proposing to John F. Kennedy to blow up a mall in Miami and blame it on Castro. So that was and he explained that there's real politics, and that the elections are designed to divide and conquer the population, and that the intelligence community always determines who's in power. And so that I had that education, while my other grandfather was teaching me the Latin names of plants in the Grand Canyon and taking me to see the Hopi. So that would be, basically my childhood is like that. Well, originally I was a communist in the fourth grade because we loved Sputnik me and my friend Gerald Flanagan. We were the entire Communist Party of Luray, Virginia, because we loved spaceflight. But then I was handed in the fifth grade by my father the book Walden, by Henry David Thoreau. And I had, because I had dyslexia, and thankfully, Mrs. Den Hartog was this dyslexia teaching specialist, and I learned to read in the fifth grade. And so the very first adult thing I read was On the Duty to Civil Disobedience. So in the fifth grade, I convinced Gerald to switch over to be an anarchist. So we became anarchists. And so that's when I started being an anarchist. I was very influenced by that book. But the also the all the stuff about of seeing the Hopi dances and being in this sacred land before there was power lines and coal mining, and I got to see the very first pouring of concrete for Glen Canyon Dam, and I got to go which is now flooded by Lake Powell to see the Onistadity ruins. And so I saw a Southwest and a wilderness. When I first crossed America in 1960, we went on Route 66, which there was not an interstate highway system yet, and there were no fences along Route 66 all the way from basically from probably Albuquerque all the way to Flagstaff, which is where we turned off to go to the canyon, where I lived for a couple of years. And then anyway, so that all had a huge influence, because then when I was 16 at Wasatch Academy, I went hiking to the top of the Wasatch Mountains one day by myself, and I looked down the valleys, and there was all this black smoke coming up the Utah valleys. And I was like, oh man, must be coming from the new power stations at Shiprock and the coal being mined at Big Mountain. And so I, at that exact moment, dedicated my life to ending any kind of political and economic system that would desecrate such a sacred land. And so that was the moment that I just totally that's it, I'm going to start organizing endlessly against capitalism. Then other influences were that we spent the night in the Black neighborhood of Philadelphia during the Martin Luther King riots, and we actually drove down Germantown Avenue, where the military was stationed on every block, and the local Black people were scurrying around trying not to get caught up in anything. And then the fires all raged that night and filled our hotel room full of smoke. And that had a huge influence, because we also saw all the military coming into DC, and we could see the smoke coming out of DC on our way to Philadelphia, and you could see Baltimore burning. And so that had a real big influence. And then I really appreciated like the yippies, like Abby Hoffman and that kind of street theater type of thing, which definitely played a huge role later on when I started organizing, when I helped co-found Food Not Bombs, which was really a theater group in 1980. And we grew out of like two protests that we were involved in, the October 6, 1979 occupation attempt of the Seabrook Nuclear Power Station construction site in New Hampshire. And then we tried it again on May 24th of 1980. And that was the date that the collective that became the first Food Not Bombs group was formed on our way back after we bailed one of our friends, Brian Feigenbaum, out of jail. And so one of the other co-founders was super active with the Living Theater. And we actually, some of the founders of Food Not Bombs provided meals at the theater games for the Living Theater. And then we're also influenced by Bread and Puppet Theater up in Northeast Kingdom, I guess is what it's called, in Vermont. And so, that's the connection between the yippies and then the theatrical aspects of Food Not Bombs. I think there's a direct link there. So part of what my political education really was working, but when I was 18, so I started working when I was 14, and I had like construction jobs, and I worked in restaurants and as a janitor and things like that. I actually made the letter N. I was the foreman for a floor that made the letter N's for New Balance tennis shoes. That's when I read 1984 during those breaks and so on. And also, I continued to mostly sell pot and I had a brief stint in cocaine sales when then I realized it was connected to Oliver North and Iran-Contra and abandoned that. That's a nasty drug. But at the time, they said it was like safe and non-addictive. And anyway, so all those kinds of experiences were really important education for me. And then when I started doing Food Not Bombs, originally the first 8 years I was in Boston, and I was also started a design company called Brushfire Graphics. I should point out like that when I got arrested in Portland, Oregon, when I was superintendent of the Portland Art Museum, which was I was 18, I was a janitor basically, but I had the keys to the building and I coordinated the other janitors. And but I got arrested by the Portland police and was beaten up, and then I backed over both of. So they ordered me to pull out back into the parking space in front of my apartment, and I accidentally hit the first motorcycle of the two motorcycles of the cops. So I was like, I'm not getting back out of the car and getting beat up more. So I backed over both motorcycles and I fled. And I eventually get arrested in the Hawthorne Bridge and spend 7 days in jail. And then when I went to my public defender, they said, look, you're going to spend like 7, 8 years at the county jail. You're real young. You should jump bail. So I jumped bail. And I never used my social security number again after that. And so I lived free, basically, of any kind of social restraints of the government. But to me, that was great because, I was already an anarchist. And so then and I worked like out in Burbank and Motor Day Clothing. I set up a business during the oil embargo where I would drive cars to the gas station and I'd just read books while waiting. Things like that. And then when I ended up, I got a job after high school as a sign painter for the National Park Service at Fire Island. And then when I got done with that, I came back to Boston, and that's when I was waiting to talk to my father at his office on State Street. He was the regional park naturalist for North Atlantic region of the Park Service. And an architect that was also waiting to visit him suggested I go to art school and then he would get me in. So he got me into Boston University. And thankfully, I was about a week into the classes when he got me in, because if I had to have a SAT score to get in, I would have never got in because I had probably the lowest score in world history. And anyway, so I actually took out two loans for school. And then I realized I never had to pay for school. So I went a total of 6 years because I became friends with the professors and I did the master's program completely, but I never got like a degree because I never gave them any money. And it was at that time I also became friends with Howard Zinn. I took American history with him, and I was in the little anarchist collective hedge school, which Zinn and Terry Taylor and Jim Goodnow and a bunch of us were all a part of. And we were organizing against tuition hikes at Boston University, defending. They're trying to get rid of Zinn, and so we're organizing against that kind of stuff. So that was kind of my first anarchist organizing stuff was really in college. And then during the art school, they were like, "Oh, go down to the galleries on Newbury Street and see what it's like when you're going to sell your paintings to these places." And it was the height of yuppies and BMWs and cocaine, and all that. So I was disgusted by what I saw. But my job at that time was running I was one of the of two employees at the Old South Meeting House on Milk Street, which is where the Boston Tea Party started. And I had to give lectures about the Boston Tea Party and things. And then I go out to the Boston Commons to have lunch, and I see this woman on a milk crate talking about nuclear war. And her name turned out to be Dr. Helen Collicott. And so I thought, man, that's what I'm going to do with my art. I'm just going to organize against nuclear war. Because of my grandfather's insistence on dropping the atomic bomb on Hanoi, I really could resonate with that. And so then that's what I started doing, and that's all. I started doing graffiti. I made these stencils of a nuclear explosion with the question today, and I spray painted about 380 of those around Boston. Also made a poster called "War is Murder for Profit" with my girlfriend Karen at the time, and we glued those all over town. So we did a lot of that as I was evolving into what became Food Not Bombs, and we continued to do that after that. And then in the early part of Food Not Bombs, we also had a focus on organizing for the second special session on nuclear disarmament at the UN and the protest that was coinciding with it, with 1 million people showed up, as it turned out. And that was on June 12th, 1982. And that kind of marks the end of the original collective of Food Not Bombs, because virtually everybody except for two of us stopped doing, or maybe even, yeah, basically two of us stopped doing Food Not Bombs. And I just continued to go on until I ended up getting in serious trouble in like 1986 with the mafia, because I was defending the rights of homeless people in my neighborhood, and I had a graphic design company. And it turned out that these mobsters were also hooked up with the FBI as well. And so I eventually get death threats, and my then wife and I flee, and we go underground. And but that was cool because I already didn't have a social security number. I was already kind of essentially underground. So then we ended up in San Francisco, and then I had provided food at a protest for Veterans for Peace, where Brian Wilson had attended. So when he got hit by a train during Nuremberg actions at Concord Naval Weapons Stations in California, my wife and I went to the protest that Saturday, and we were hiding. We were underground. In those days you could do this alias thing. So when there was any utilities or any kind of thing that I needed to conceal my identity in Boston, well, I was always Michael Sullivan, because if you open the white pages, back when they had white pages, we always chose, this is a trick the Weather Underground taught, you would choose the most common name. And so when I got to San Francisco, I chose Dick Lee. Oddly enough, the person that turned me on to this idea was called Dick Lee. So anyway, so then we went home after the big rally, and we noticed that we were in the foreground of a group of people tearing up the tracks. And so Andrea, my wife, goes, "Oh man, we should go back to doing Food Not Bombs. Our cover's blown." So we did. And on August 15th, 1988, we ended up getting arrested at Golden Gate Park. That was the first arrest. I got arrested. I'd just been released from the hospital across Panhandle from a ruptured appendix. And so I get arrested, and 8 others get arrested, and the community there freaked out. And there was a big photo by a person by the name of Greg Garr in the page 3 of the San Francisco Chronicle. And so people said, "We got to do marches and protests against this. This can't stand." And so then we started having this series of marches every Monday. And it turned out the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force came to the second arrest. 24 people arrested on August 22nd of 88. And they declared us a credible national security threat in a memo to the San Francisco FBI field office. And so that Thanksgiving, we were the subject of National Guard classes on domestic terrorism, claimed to be one of America's most hardcore terrorist groups. So anyway, in the end, we end up getting arrested a total of 1,000 times. I got charged with California three strikes, assault, battery, strong arm robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and possession of stolen property. Faced 25 to life. That actually, along each wave of arrests, created this interest in the world with Food Not Bombs. So when there was only Long Beach, Food Not Bombs, Boston, and San Francisco, when the FBI claimed we were a national security threat, and there was only about 30 volunteers. But it turned so that it every time there'd be a wave of arrest, or like when I get the news of me facing life in prison made the media, people would then send letters to us in San Francisco asking how they could start their own Food Not Bombs chapter. So I'd taken notes on how I started the San Francisco group, and I made a flyer called 7 Steps to Starting a Food Not Bombs and would mail that to people. This is before the internet and so on. And then we learned that the native people were going to protest the 500th anniversary of Europe invading North the Americas, and the celebration that the U.S. government was holding was in San Francisco, oddly enough. So we had our first World Gathering in '92, and that's when we came up with the 3 principles, that the food is always vegan or vegetarian and free to anyone, rich or poor, drunk or sober. That there we were that there was there were no leaders or headquarters or directors, that each group is autonomous and would make decisions using consensus, and would try to encourage the people that were depending on our food to also be involved in making the decisions of your local chapter, and that we were not a charity, that we were dedicated to taking nonviolent direct action to change society so no one would have to live in the streets or eat at a soup kitchen. And then we reaffirmed that at a much larger gathering in 1995 when we were protesting the mayor's dedication of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at UN Plaza on the 50th anniversary of the founding of the UN. And because he was rounding up the homeless, that particular mayor was Frank Jordan. And so we had 10 days at that time that we gathered. And that's when we invented indie media. So we had our own Convergence Center and a top floor of a theater on Market Street. We also, by that time, in '92, we had started Homes Not Jails with the San Francisco Tenants Union and Food Not Bombs. So we had keys to 400 buildings and people living in 100 of them through that squatting season. That was the savings and loan crisis that we were protesting. And the attacks against the homeless. They had this thing called Quality of Life Enforcement Matrix program to torment, to criminalize the homeless. That's already in '92. They're doing that. And then we also had pirate radio stations. Stephen Duniford made the first FM low watt transmitter. So we had classes on how to make FM radio transmitters. And the station I was with one of the original Food Not Bombs people, Joe Swanson, and her boyfriend, Richard Edmondson, we had San Francisco Liberation Radio, and we broadcast from the tops of the hills of San Francisco. And then we also started a gardening project, which became known as Food Not Lawns. So we were kind of trying to create a full spectrum of media and housing and food and culture. We're really tied into the punk scene, and we were having bands, raise money for us. And we were getting arrested every day for serving food. So we had clandestine ways of tricking the police and doing that, where we'd have decoy buckets of soup that weren't real, and then they would arrest those people, but the real food would come in after the second wave of arrests. So those 2 gatherings, world gatherings, ended up like encouraging Food Not Bombs to go even further. So it's then in '97 I became the director of the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee in Lawrence, Kansas for 3 years, and then the FBI really completely trashed that, which is common. And before that, I was doing these tours. I did what was called the Rent as Theft tour, where I would use my FM radio transmitter and broadcast I would do a cooking demonstration dressed in a chef's hat and chef's coat. And I did a bunch of those, like all around the country, particularly right after I settled my case in '95, because I did not want to, even though my probation was super lenient, I was not allowed to bomb anybody or kill anyone, but otherwise I could be arrested and not violated. But I still thought wise to stay out of town. So I did a tour, I'd already done a tour of Europe in '92, but now I started doing in my truck, driving around North America with my dog Pluto and just giving lectures and stuff. And I did that to stay out of town for a long time. And then as a consequence, I ended up in Lawrence, Kansas, saving the Peltier Defense Committee from when the FBI was about to shut it down. And I became, quite, talked to Leonard every day and so on. But then at the end of that, I became homeless in Kansas City, Missouri. And I ended up getting a job as the graphic designer for Current News, which was Kansas City's preeminent drag queen magazine. Did that for a while, and then eventually met a heterosexual woman, and we got married. Probably she was a honey trap because I lost everything about 2 years later, and became homeless again. And she took the house that we bought together, and so on. That was pretty brutal, and so anyway, also I was working at United Way at that time, and when the FBI called up the United Way and said I was a domestic terrorist, and that because of 9/11 had just happened, they had to let me go. So I got fired. Then I got another job, got fired, got a third job, and that woman, Mitzi Theron, was really cool. She said, "Oh wow, I got a call from the authorities. You're on a blacklist. You're not allowed to work in the United States." And so that was the end of me working above ground at all in the United States. And then, so then I just did the touring thing, and I lived in a van, and I eventually moved to Taos, New Mexico, and I started a project called the Taos Peace House and Info Shop with some money I got from Ben and Jerry's ice cream. And then FBI did that in. So then but fortunately, I got hit by a drunk lady and I had money. So I bought an acre of land and I started another thing called the Food Not Bombs Free School. And people from all the world would come and camp there for $25 a week and learn, organic gardening and adobe brick building and things like that. That was a really cool project. I lived in my school bus and my van there for a long time. I think I was there total of 15 years in Taos. And then I was on a tour and I ended up a lady in Santa Cruz said, "Hey, I've got problems with your website. I tried to order a poster from you, but it said clay doves." And I go, "Oh, I'm bad at code writing for PayPal and stuff like that. Just send whatever it is." And I talked her into me coming to Santa Cruz to give a lecture on Food Not Bombs on right out, and I had done that whole Occupy thing. I was actually got Kevin Zees and Margaret Flowers had invited me to set up a kitchen at Freedom Plaza uh, before Occupy even was a thing. But oddly enough, at the same time, it's supposed to be, I think, the anniversary of the war in Afghanistan or something. So I'd already made arrangements to bring like hundreds of pounds of rice to DC. But I got arrested feeding people in Orlando, and when I finally got out, I like continued on that path. But then Occupy happened, and so then I went to that year. I did all my lectures at Occupy, and that was really fun. But anyway, at the end of that, I end up giving a lecture in Santa Cruz, and I end up making friends here. And I start coming back and forth from Taos to Santa Cruz, and eventually things got real gnarly with Food Not Bombs in Taos, so I sold my land and stayed in Santa Cruz. But I'm still not allowed to work, and I mostly, that's what I do. I wrote a couple of three books. I wrote Food Not Bombs, How to Feed the Hungry, Build Community. I had a falling out with my co-author on that one. He insisted we should become famous and start making money. I told him, like, screw off. And so he discontinued his relationship with me. And then I rewrote that book in a more updated version called Hungry for Peace. And then after that, I wrote a new version of the Anarchist Cookbook because the final straw for that was the Cleveland kids, Food Not Bombs kids at Occupy, got arrested for attempting to bomb a bridge, and they were set up by the FBI. And one of the things in the complaint, the federal complaint, they said they had a copy of Anarchist Cookbook, Anarchist Cookbook, Anarchist Cookbook, right? So I'm going, that's like the fifth person I know that went to prison because the FBI gave him a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook and circled the C5. So that's like insane. And then people get mad at me because they'd buy the Anarchist Cookbook thinking it was Hungry for Peace and there were no vegan recipes or anything about anarchism in it. So I started writing William Powell, the author of the original Anarchist Cookbook. He was a principal of a private school in Kuala Lumpur at the time. and he said, "Yeah, just go for it, rewrite it." And I specifically wanted to use his denunciation of his original book as the forward in my book, and he agreed to do that. And so that that was that book, and so that's sort of a brief trajectory of my being an anarchist. The things that I appreciate about anarchism is the non-hierarchical, decentralized nature of it, and that it kind of more reflects the natural human condition that would be have been, in some senses, often the case. Although there are definitely hierarchies and kings and chiefs and so on, but I think if there were not power struggles to dominate, a lot more people would really appreciate that. So one of the things that was important so the eight of us that started Food Not Bombs, we're anarchists, but we don't really promote anarchism specifically in the Food Not Bombs world as a label. It's because we want people to actually do anarchism, and that's what you're doing when you're doing Food Not Bombs. So in a certain sense, that's been really effective. An interesting stage in anarchism is when the Soviet Union collapsed. Many people in what used to be called Eastern Europe, which is now called Central Europe, gravitated towards anarchism. And I had the blessing of hanging out with them even in '92 when I toured Europe, but also, you know, many times since then. And they had seized all kinds of property that the communists owned, and therefore nobody knew who owned them, so they would take them. So like in Poznan, Poland, they had an entire huge industrial site with the largest anarchist library in Eastern, outside of Russia at the time, and so of Eastern in Eastern Europe. And so it was really a fascinating thing seeing people work together to be outside the state completely. So in part, obviously, I've tried to live my life as an anarchist. That's why it's been convenient never to, not to have a social security number. It's not to have, and right now I think it's the best time in world history for anarchism, because, and you don't have to call yourself anarchism, but the ideology of anarchism, the decentralized, non-hierarchical, mutual aid, focus on what's the real needs of people are aspect of anarchism, um, is really valuable, because we're going into this techno feudalist system where within a year or two, everybody will be hooked up to the digital, this dystopian digital matrix, right? That's their goal. And everything, like Larry Ellison said, everybody will be on their best behavior because AI makes it possible for us to monitor all activity of all people at all times. And now they're instituting that with Stargate and with Doge and Palantir and all these things like that. Now, rounding up the homeless to put them in concentration camps, all the things that we have been warning about are now happening. So it's an ideal time to be an anarchist, because you're really going to have to be sort of like Winston Smith before he capitulates in 1984, where you leave society and you create your own society free of digital constraints. That'd be very difficult. We can see with the COVID warfare thing that went on with Operation Warp Speed, and then forcing people into their houses and forcing them into using counter military countermeasures that were developed at the same time they developed the COVID itself. That it's easy to splinter everybody and to do social control. So up until March of 2020, our slogan was question authority, and that we would not obey, we would not cooperate with the economic and political system as much as we could. And unfortunately, that fell to the wayside. I think that really just blew up the anarchist community into being authoritarian. Many anarchists basically became authoritarian, and that was a real shame. But I think that human nature is such that people will eventually reject that kind of thing, seeing that obeying the government is completely, it's insanity. And so, you could see, I think that when COVID happened here in Santa Cruz, when they started announcing that, I had just gotten back from a writers' workshop in Guatemala, and they were going to cage all the homeless in parking lots in Santa Cruz and they're like, screw that. So and there was all the soup kitchens were closed, and they were like trying to control the access to water and all these things to hundreds and hundreds of homeless people. So we just said, let's just set up our own system. And so we fed people every day for 3 years, and we provided clothing, food, water. We had free concerts on every holiday during the 3 years of the lockdown. And we just ignored the lockdown and just went forward with life and built our own little world. Um, the government would evict us from a parking lot, or they'd evict us from someplace. We were able to stop the caging of the homeless immediately by, we basically started feeding the people in the first cage, and they gave up and said, okay, we just thought we're not going to really cage people. But they tried to get food up bombs to lure the people into the cages, and I told the mayor, screw that, we're not into totalitarian fascist state, we're not cooperating with you. So, and then there's been some other beautiful things about that. Though we got a cease and desist order from feeding the homeless in Santa Cruz, and of course we didn't respond to it, and we ignored it. And then like 5 months later, 4 months later, people will start coming back. Didn't you get the order that you're not allowed to do this? And we go, yeah, of course. But we ignored it. So we kind of built this like subculture of consciousness in Santa Cruz. People probably wouldn't identify this exactly. I mean, there's no way to measure it. But the fact that so many people and then we got a law against us serving where we serve, and we still serve now we just serve Saturdays and Sundays, but we're prepared to do more. We just moved we bought a 20-foot shipping container and plopped it on a city parking lot and used that to operate out of for months and months and months. And then when the city tried to steal it from us, we just moved it to another parking lot. And that's what, and then eventually we made an off-grid, commercial kitchen and all these things like that. So it's been a really, living as an anarchist, you didn't have any, all this authoritarian stuff. You just automatically know, well, screw all that and just build your own life the way you wanted to outside of the system. And I just think that probably will be the saving grace for humanity. Almost like when we started Freedom Bombs, Reagan got elected, and we kind of thought, well, we're going to go into the dark ages, because that 8 years of Reagan, which at the time seemed really brutal and horrible, and which resulted in, by the end, when he got out, when he was no longer president, there was allegedly 750,000 homeless Americans, right? And there were not even a number when he came to office. And in fact, our first event was on March 26, 1981, outside the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston, to protest the investment policies of the bank. And I had gone to the homeless shelter, Pine Street Inn, and encouraged them to come to the protest, not really thinking that it was about them eating, but it's about them protesting. And they came, and they said, there's no food for homeless people in Boston. You should do this every day. So we said, oh, that's a great idea. So we gave 2 weeks notice at all of our jobs, and then just did it every day for 6 months, until the landlady of our collective house pointed out we had never paid the rent. And she said, well, apparently it's too much money. She lowered the rent, but she said, what you're doing, everybody in Cambridge thinks you guys are amazing, so I can't evict you. And then she rented another apartment to some other Freedom Bombs people later. But anyway, so this whole, you thought it was bad under Reagan. Now we're in the second Trump era, the post Biden fascist era. We're in this whole thing, and hopefully the whole drama of this cancel culture and using diversity as a weapon, right? It's really sad that we used to be for Black liberation. I was we fed the Black Liberation Army at Columbia Point housing projects. This was all these things. I was real involved in ACT UP. These were all revolutionary movements that the Democratic Party then sucked up into this kind of, they just basically co-opted it into being a corporate. It's all about corporations and having diversity in corporations, and then the liberation aspect of it all disappeared. Hopefully, because of how brutal the new system is, that people will gravitate back to the point of view of anarchism's kind of roots, even if they don't call themselves anarchism. And it makes a lot, with the one of the aspects of the first anarchist cookbook that helped highlight the idea that was probably originally promoted with the Haymarket massacres and in Chicago. We're hopefully diluting that ideology of anarchism with the new book, Anarchist Cookbook, and that people will start to, people the least interested in these ideas will start to see it in a different way, and there'll be less of an assumption, but the government will still. I'm sure that there'll be just like the Palmer raids that took out like Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and them in the before around World War I. There'll probably be another. I mean, there's already trying to connect food not bombs to this group of people, which may be true actually, but where the Prairieland ICE detention center, they claim that all the people that did the action were met at Food Not Bombs, although there's a couple of people who actually the two people that supposedly brought guns, according to the feds, didn't seem to have any connection to the other people that were launching fireworks on 4th of July and spray painting ICE vehicles. But now they're facing time, just like the poor kids at the occupied Cleveland, or just like Eric McDavid. We've gone through a whole series of Food Not Bombs activists being, jailed and accused of terrorism and sadly often convicted of terrorism, even if, like in the case of Eric McDavid, he had no idea he was thinking anything about terrorism. It was just an FBI informant that was trying to be a honeypot that failed on that regard, but did succeed at him doing a decade in prison. But so yeah, I think it's a really beautiful time to be an anarchist, because I think that society becomes like this technological, digitally controlled, programmable, stable coins and facial recognition to get on the internet and all the stuff that was coming down here in the near future. That being an anarchist will be the kind of, or at least the philosophy, the basic core ideas of anarchism and mutual aid will be the kind of like we felt when Reagan got elected, we would be the monks of the time, and we would hold some kind of vision of positive ideology through the dark ages of Reagan. It might be the same kind of thing going on now with and let's hope these dark ages don't last the 8 years, but likely to last maybe the remainder of our lives. But at least there'll be us outside of the system, and then the poor people suffering in the system, and then hopefully seeing our example, they will like, oh, screw that. We're leaving the society. We're not making any money in society. We've got a digital leash. Our money is turned on and turned off at the whim of the government. Screw it. We'll just go out into the wilderness with all the other anarchist mutual aid groups and see what we can do. It's great you're doing this project. I love that. And I've watched a bunch of the videos. It was funny seeing Chris Carlson's video and reminded me of Bob Black. He tried to get into a fist fight with the head of police intelligence during the second wave of arrests when the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force declared us. So he got arrested, and he was in there trying to get like Dick Holder to fight him, and that if Holder's like, well, if I beat you up, then they have to stop serving food, and Bob Black is, if I beat you up, we get to serve food, and I'm like, what? And I'm in the jail. I think this guy's like nuts. But I remember when he tried to burn typesetting, etc. down and all that stuff. It was really funny seeing that. But yeah, it's a funny thing. And it is interesting how many anarchists are no longer wanting to use the term anarchy. But I say, screw it, man. I'm an anarchist. I've been an anarchist since the 60s. I'm going to be an anarchist. I'm going to own it. And I've been tortured. I was put in a stress fishing cage 3 times by the San Francisco Police Department, had all my ligaments and tendons ripped. I've lost everything I owned a bunch of times. I've done a huge amount of time in jail, and no one's going to intimidate me. That's it. They're not going to bad, I know, like, the Wikipedia has me as like some kind of right-wing crazy conspiracy theorist, right? But CIA writes Wikipedia. So there you go.